we return to the issue of electrification of transportation that we touched on in season one with two distinguished guests, Dr. Genevieve Guiliano from USC and Dr. Beia Spiller from the Resources for the Future. This topic is more than just about how many EVs are sold and how many charging stations are built, but it's about how reimagining mobility and its impact on our lifestyles. Modern cities in the United States were built for cars, so we have made room for roads and parking spaces and refueling stations. The famed American lifestyle was developed around car ownership and the freedom of the road. But what makes a different future of mobility look like? Listening in while we talk to two researchers that think about those options and implications for a living.
Well, Dr. Spiller, we want to welcome you again to Energy Transition Talk, sponsored by USC, Urshagi Center for Energy Transition. Really want to thank you for coming back again. You were a great guest on season one and season two. We having you back and to go into some of these topics a little bit more detail is a great opportunity for us. Um, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your current role at RFF, or Resources for the Future? We got to know you in season one, but hopefully going to be some new people here for season two.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me back. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and share some of my thoughts. So I'm an environmental economist. I've been working on transportation research since back in my PhD. Back then, I was really focused more on gasoline policy, gasoline taxes, for example. Back then, EVs were not really a viable solution. But once I graduated, I was working at Environmental Defense Fund. And around 2020 or so, we started to work on electric trucks, so truck electrification. And that was really exciting for me because these vehicles have the potential to really reduce local air emissions, as well as reduce their contribution to greenhouse gases. And so we were advocating at the time for policies that would help accelerate adoption of these vehicles, but also making sure that the impact on the electric grid was minimized. Now, when I went to Resources for the Future, which is a non-advocacy research organization, I was hired to build and lead the organization's transportation program. So then I really wanted to focus on what are the big policy relevant research questions that we can conduct to help answer some questions about, how do we overcome some of the biggest challenges and barriers to transportation decarbonization. So that's what I've been doing these past couple of years.
Well, at USC, obviously sitting in Los Angeles with both the personal car uh, issue and then the Port of Los Angeles with all the heavy trucks and all the rest of that, both the issues of the small, I guess, scale electrification and then the large scale ones are pretty important for a city like that. But that would also be true, I guess, in Houston and Baltimore and Philadelphia, San Francisco, a lot of those ones that have both the light and the heavy sort of transportation sort of needs. So to move on, excuse me. In our research for this episode, we came across this quote, and I'd like to just get your reaction and maybe talk about it a little bit, because it has to do with this idea of the policy and technology and economic trends and how they're working or not working, I guess. So this is the quote: "The scale of the challenge of getting to net zero transportation system is, I think, much bigger than folks want to acknowledge." This is from Costa Samaras, the director of the Wilton Scott Institute for Energy Innovation at Carnegie Mellon. "To meet emissions targets, ridiculously high levels of electrification are needed," he said. "We also at the same time need to be building the types of communities that enable folks to move around without needing a car." How do you think all these things are going? Is it as big and difficult a challenge as Mr. Samaras said?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the challenge is massive, right? Because one thing that Costa didn't mention in that quote is the fact that even just getting people to adopt new EVs does nothing about the fact that we have a huge amount of gasoline and diesel vehicles continuing to circulate, on the roads. And so it's going to take decades for us to actually get those vehicles, scrapped, right? So even if we have 100% new electric vehicle car purchases, we're still going to have gasoline vehicles on the road for, the next several decades. And I will say, though, that I don't think that the only solution to decarbonization is by going electric, right? Because one of the best ways to decarbonize is to get people out of their own vehicles and into public transit, micromobility, walking, right? Getting people to do more remote work, for example, not have to be commuting every single day. So some of these solutions, right, particularly the ones where we're talking about micromobility and public transit, it's really, really hard to implement when you have the cities and the suburbs that we have, right? There's a lot of sprawl. And in many locations, it's just really hard to get around in public transit, right? So you have these cities that are not conducive to doing anything other than just driving. And quite frankly, we make it really easy to drive, right? There's so much parking spots in this country. There are cities that have almost 50% of their landmass covered in parking spots. San Bernardino, California is one. It's like 49% of their landmass is covered in parking spots. I mean, that is nuts, right? So it requires us to think really holistically about what are the policies that we can implement, both push and pull policies that can get people out of their cars. And so let's talk about some of these sort of the push policies, the stick policies, right? Which is, for example, let's make it more expensive to drive. Let's make it more difficult to drive. And what does that entail? That requires, let's get rid of some of these parking spots or make it so that it's not free to park, right? Let's make it more expensive to park. That reduces the incentive to drive and makes public transit more attractive. And so one example, this weekend, we were thinking about, do we drive into the city or do we take public transit, the metro? It was actually, it's free to park at the time I was going. And I was like, it's actually more expensive to take public transit than it is to drive. And because it was cold, we decided to drive. So why is it free for me to go into the city and free for me to park my car, right? Like this type of policy should not be there. And so it's exciting to see congestion pricing coming into New York City. That's going to be happening early next year, if all things move forward well, because that will make it much more expensive for me to come into the city in my car and will make public transit much more, relatively attractive. And so, I will just say, right, it's not just about the sticks. We also have to make it more attractive to take public transit. And it's hard to do in some cities, like expanding the metro, for example, is extremely expensive. So one of the best solutions are, for example, rapid bus transit, right? So that it's not so slow to take the bus. And it sounds kind of straightforward, but I want to mention, we published a paper several years ago. This came out of some of my grad school research. But basically what we were looking at was how people switch off between public versus private modes of transportation commuting. And so we looked at how long it would take folks to commute based on a public transit option versus a private transit option. And what we found was that the biggest, like, if it took you far more time to commute on public transit, you're much less likely to do that, right? So improving the time that it takes for you to commute would actually allow people to be able to shift to public transit and reduce their vehicle miles traveled. But what we also found was that gasoline taxes, which is a stick policy, right, makes it more expensive to drive, was actually really effective in reducing vehicle miles traveled. And interestingly, these two policies together, so increasing the price of gasoline through gasoline taxes while also reducing the time it takes you to take public transit to work. Both of these policies together resulted in the highest impact on reducing vehicle miles traveled and shifting driving to public modes. So it requires us to think, about the whole suite of policies that we could be implementing to make it less attractive to drive and more attractive to take public transit. And that's the only way we're going to be able to shift, people's behavior.
I guess there's a lot of European examples of, say, of the cost and driving into central London is you have that extra tax, like the city of New
Very
York
expensive.
is trying to talk about, and other
That's
cities
very
are just
expensive.
having no drive internal areas where you're just not allowed to bring a car, and at the same time, as you said, make an alternative easier to not to say, well, it's just the same or it's better, or or whatever, not just from the emissions environmental side of it, but the speed at which doing it, the cost, kind of putting all of those kind of things together. um but just as an example for me yesterday, in the city of Denver, which is another really large metro built for cars, and freeways everywhere. And I went to a Denver Bronco football game, and me and 74,999 of my closest friends, we all drove, just about, and there was parking all around, and of course there was a huge traffic jam getting around and trying to get home and everything. But the mayor and the governor of Colorado are trying to have an idea of this thing they call, 15-minute cities, of transit hubs related to buses or trains, next to affordable housing, next to jobs and shopping and all the rest of this, so that it kind of breaks the paradigm of I have to get in my car and go a long way to get to wherever it is I'm going, my job, my the shopping mall, or whatever kind of things with regard to that. What do you think of this? Whether you talk about Governor Polis's idea or anything similar, this idea of rethinking cities based on the local mobility kind of axis.
Well, I think rethinking cities to improve mobility is really important, but it's hard to do it, right? I mean, it's hard to structurally change the layout of our cities. It takes a lot of time. And so there's ways that we can try to improve mobility through investments that don't require a massive restructuring of the city. And so one example is with the charging stations, so electric vehicle charging stations, right? So we move forward to put these charging stations in place. The main discussions around these investments is we need to get these charging stations in so that people can charge their vehicles, right? But there's different approaches to take when we think about how to make these investments, and part of it can really be to improve mobility and to improve other types of aspects of well-being for the community. And so we've actually been thinking a lot about the charging station question in the framework of this paper that we published earlier this fall. So this is a paper with a colleague of mine, Suzanne Rousseau from RFF, and Rachel Wilberding. She was a student at Fordham when we were writing this paper, but now she's at the Department of Transportation. So this paper was asking the question of, how can we make these investments? So a lot of these investments are coming. Like, for example, California just allocated like $1.5 billion or something to invest in a huge number of charging stations over the next several years. So these investments are coming. And what do those investments look like? And can they actually help improve? Can they actually help improve equity outcomes? And fundamentally not exacerbate existing inequities. That was the main objective of what we're talking about. So what we said was, the first step needs to be that the local authorities, right, those who are sort of in charge of siting and permitting and stuff like that, need to think about what are the challenges of the folks living in the community space. What are these inequities that they face? Do they have mobility issues? Are they facing a lot of pollution from medium heavy duty vehicles? Are they, what kind of aspects have led to inequities, either within the transportation sector or beyond, for which these investments could exacerbate? So one example of how it might exacerbate is if you put charging stations in a location and there's now all of a sudden more congestion because people are driving to charge their vehicles there, right? So it requires a more deliberate approach. And so we say, like, think about what are the challenges in your location. And then based on what those challenges are, start to think about what does it mean to actually benefit from these investments? Because part of the benefit is being able to charge your car, but it's not just that. There's so many other benefits associated with these investments that could be had. For example, sort of spillover effects, right? If we put a charging station near shops and restaurants, people will leave their car charging there and maybe go out and buy something. And there's actually research that have shown that there are these economic spillover effects. But depending on where you put it, you're going to have a greater or, a less a positive sort of spillover effect. Furthermore, like, who's actually owning and operating and profiting from these stations, right? Are there alternative ownership structures that could be had to bring some funds back into the hands of the community, some funds that could be repurposed to improve mobility, to, improve well-being in the community? And so particularly in the setting of, places that have mobility issues, charging stations can be placed strategically. So they could support, for example, more micro mobility sites, or they could be used to, for example, support the electrification of on-demand minibus shuttles. These minibus shuttles, what they're doing, so this is actually popping up in a lot of smaller and mid-sized cities across the country, where transit authorities are saying, we have these little transit deserts, right? We don't have big bus service. We don't have metro, right? And there's maybe no micromobility. Let's put in an on-demand shuttle where people can actually call and get the shuttle come pick them up at their home and take them where they want to go. And so this drastically improves mobility for these people who live in transit desert. And if we put in charging stations that can help support these shuttles, these electric shuttles, then you get both the environmental emissions reductions, the emissions reductions, while at the same time improving mobility. And this type of approach is actually happening. And I'm just going to give an example. So the charging and fueling infrastructure grants, this is a big part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed a couple of years ago, the federal level. And this provides a lot, billions of dollars to cities to put charging stations in their cities. And so the first round of grants went out, and one of the recipients was Boise, Idaho. So Boise was planning on doing this really massive investment in charging stations, a lot of level 2, a lot of fast chargers. But rather than just be like, we're just going to make all these investments, they took a really deliberate approach to ensure that these investments were being done with an eye to improving equity outcomes and to ensuring community engagement. So they, for example, they were, looking at micro mobility and working with the community to make sure that these investments were happening in a way that was beneficial to the community. So I think that, yes, we need to move quickly. There's always this urge for us to move quickly, but a lot of these things are going to take time. And especially like charging station investments, it takes a while to get these things up and running, right? You have to get the utility upgrades and so on and so forth. And so I think that because it's not that fast to do it anyways, we can leverage the time that it takes to actually sort of the technological issues that slow down the pace of investment. We can take that time, talk with the community, and make sure that we're really addressing the fundamental issues around mobility for the community through these charging station investments.
Well, in season 1, when we talked to you, introduced us to the thought that it's not electrification of transportation as we see it today. It's reimagining mobility, and you just kind of talked about that. But obviously, there's no one size fits all, right? I mean, my son-in-law works for a high-tech company in Silicon Valley, and he's got an app on his phone, and there's lots of charging in the parking garage next to his headquarters. And he gets a little message saying, it's your time for the next 2 hours. You can charge your car. And so it's all taken care of, right? And he doesn't have to think too much about it. Yet that's a pretty, kind of high end sort of community with
Yeah.
regard to that. Now, you go into downtown Los Angeles and you're a construction worker, or you're, some sort of retail or food service sort of industry. I mean, you probably can't even afford a Tesla right now. So, I mean, your need and what you benefit from, what are those cost benefit analysis sort of things? I mean, they're different for all kinds of different communities, right? You mentioned micro mobility, and I guess that's a place where in Asia a lot you can have the scooters and the e-bikes, and you don't have to have a monster infrastructure. You don't have to have a even by theory about a car, but and even a lot of those are taxis, right? One or two person in the back, kind of taxi sort of thing. So this, while I think that's a great way of looking at it, it's also not a simple way of looking at it.
Yeah, I
If you
mean,
were an urban transportation planner, you don't have one customer, you've got a million customers.
I think you sort of hit the nail on the head when you said that there's no one size fits all, right? A lot of people try, I get this question a lot, like, what's the optimal approach to, making these investments? There is no one optimal approach because every single situation, every single location is going to be different. Who has, who's driving? Where are they going? What does the infrastructure around where they're headed look like, right? So in New York City, for example, a lot of people commute into the city, and there's just not a lot of space for fast charging stations in New York City. Because the grid is like completely jam packed, right? So you don't have a lot of level 3 chargers within the city. So having to think about where do we put these level 3 chargers strategically so that people can get it on the way into the city, for example. So every single location is going to require a completely unique and sort of bespoke approach to investments, to thinking about what you need, and things like micromobility are great in places where honestly it doesn't get too cold, because I mean, think about like Michigan. Who's going to be driving when the snow, driving an electric bike when the snow is up to here? Like, it's not safe and it's not comfortable, right? Like, I personally don't, I have an e-bike. I do not take my bike out. I do not use it between the months of December and March, because it is just way too cold in New York City for me to be going 20 miles an hour on a bike. Freeze my butt off. And so these solutions make sense, but not always. And so we have to be cognizant of like the challenges of the location, infrastructure that we currently face, how people move around, what are the issues that they face. And it's unfortunately, there's no one size fits all, which makes it a lot more challenging, but it also puts the onus a lot on local city planners. And this is where it's really their time to shine now, and really think about like, well, we have all these federal funds coming in, maybe we have state level funds coming in. We need to do what's best for the individuals who live nearby and really help them improve their mobility while at the same time reducing emissions.
Well, that's probably going to be our quote from this season, is the no one size fits all, and maybe the flexibility or the democratization of some of these options
Yeah.
has to be a lot broader than maybe just if I do one thing, it'll fix most of my problems. It's not that, right?
Yeah.
Well, to switch just a little bit to those maybe American European car makers who wanted to think all they had to do is build a electric version of what they already have. Ford is overhauling its electric vehicle strategy, and it includes dropping a plan for new electric SUVs and pivoting towards maybe hybrid versions. Uh, Ford has continued to bleed money. It's not been successful financially, with prior forecasts that would have had between $5 and $6 billion in 2024. The strategy shifted to cost forward. That strategy has shifted so that Ford is now kind of 2 billion in the hole from all of their writing down their SUV manufacturing assets. It's also going to delay the successor to their former famous F-150 pickup truck, capex on pure FUVs, cramp ups of battery production. So with all of this stuff, I mean, so obviously not only Ford but others have struggled with that early version of the optimized solution. What's your perspective on the new EV strategy for car makers, American and European car makers?
Well, it's somewhat disheartening, right, to see car makers pulling back on their EV plans, because in the end, what we need for more adoption is more choice, right? We've moved out of the first adopters, right? First adopters were willing to purchase whatever electric vehicles they thought the tech was cool, or they want to have an environmental impact or whatever. Now we're moving to individuals who reflect the large majority of car buyers in this country. What are the main vehicles that are being purchased in this country? They are large SUVs, three-row vehicles, minivans, right? These are much more prevalent than total number of sedans, four-door sedans. And these bigger vehicles just don't exist in electric versions, right? So when these new car buyers are considering going electric, and they're like, well, I can't get my Suburban in an electric version, I'm just not going to do it, right? Because that is what I need. And so having the manufacturers sort of back down, that means that there's going to be less options out there. And quite frankly, it's very likely to turn people off from going electric. And so, if we think about the broader picture about what was the correct approach to bringing these EVs online, it's possible we just needed more time, right? Manufacturers needed to figure out how to make these vehicles at lower cost for them, but also make them more affordable so that customers can get on board. But at the same time, like at this point, backpedaling is not going to help. So I think it's problematic, and there are, of course, a lot of federal and state policies are pushing for this to happen. But if manufacturers aren't on board, I think it's kind of problematic. And so the EV strategy of the new manufacturers are going more in on hybrid, right? This seems to be pretty prevalent across a lot of different manufacturers, both domestic and international, as you had mentioned. And so, what do I think about that? Well, I think that, first of all, it is mind-boggling to me that not all of our vehicles are already hybrid. I mean, hybrid vehicles, not plug-in hybrid vehicles. The technology is proven. We don't have challenges with the technology. Like, we should have, every vehicle should be hybrid, because there's no reason that it shouldn't be, right? Like, it's not that much more expensive to produce a hybrid. People know how to drive hybrids, and the emissions benefits are massive. And so, for example, if we think about, what do we get in terms of emissions benefits from making a Suburban hybrid versus electrifying a Honda Civic, the benefits from making that Suburban hybrid are way bigger than making a Honda Civic electric, right? Because at the low scale, when we're talking about these really heavily polluting light trucks, even minor increases in fuel efficiency are going to get you huge savings in terms of gasoline. Whereas, just electrifying the really efficient vehicles, the vehicles are already really efficient, doesn't buy you as much gasoline savings. And so we could go all electric, and we could really have huge emission savings while also providing some pretty important gasoline cost relief to drivers, right? So there is this interesting outcome, I think, which is if before with the emission standards, right, is really pushing the because it's like the emission standards, what it does is it says your average emissions needs to be X. The average efficiency of your fleet needs to be X. And so by producing a lot of EVs, you can get that average up, and you can still have those really polluting SUVs and light trucks, right? Because in the end, the really high efficient EVs is going to pull your average up, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have really big improvements in terms of reduction in emissions. Whereas bringing that baseline up would do a lot better. So I'm hopeful that what this means is that we will get a lot more hybridization of those really big trucks and SUVs and minivans that, frankly, maybe it's kind of hard to electrify them at this point. The manufacturers haven't figured that out. So I'm hopeful that this will lead to actual emissions reductions by creating hybrid versions of the bigger, more dirty vehicles.
So if I'm getting what you're saying, hybrid is kind of like a transmission, a bridge step from one to maybe another, and the fact that it's not going to take years, it's going to take decades. The average, American owns a car for a decade or more, right? So and just everybody's going to go buy them tomorrow because there's a new policy that just like maybe coal to natural gas to renewable energy is a bridge that gets us noticeable benefits for an easier bridge cost than thinking you have to go all in.
I think on the electric power sector, there's more evidence coming out that natural gas maybe isn't as good as we had thought. There was some new science research that showed that in fact, natural gas, because of different issues around leakage and stuff, could actually be worse than coal. That's not what the main science is saying, but I think we're finding more and more that natural gas isn't as clean as we had hoped for a number of different reasons. And now within the electric grid, it's very cheap to go solar, to do wind, right? Like these things are actually the renewable sources are very cheap. So it's a lot easier for us to electrify the grid, for us to create renewables within the grid, than it is for us to electrify the transportation system, because we still haven't, there's the technology to a certain degree is there, but there's these challenges in terms of manufacturing. It's expensive to manufacture EVs. They still haven't really figured out how to do that really well. And so they're facing these big investment costs, and they have to recover those investment costs. So prices are still a little high. There's issues that we're seeing in the electrification space of transportation, for example, in the wintertime, right? People who are driving EVs in the winter are saying, oh, I've got such shorter range in my vehicle, right? I've lost 20–50% of my range. Now, part of that is really problematic because as more and more people adopt EVs, and they start to have these bad experiences with EVs, and they're socializing these concerns, people who are prospective buyers may not be willing to adopt it, right? They say, I don't want to deal with it. I live in Michigan. It's cold here. I'm not going to try to go electric because I'm not going to be able to drive anywhere. But look what's happening in Norway, which is a very cold country for a big portion of the year. They are almost all electric. I mean, the future is, going electric very, very quickly. I think they're like at 80% of new vehicle sales, and they've been able to deal with it. And so they have tricks of like, how do I preheat the car while it's plugged in? For example, there's different solutions that have been successful in Norway that aren't being socialized here. So a lot of it is education and understanding. So there is some technological adjustments that manufacturers would have to make to be able to really get that range up during the cold and hot periods. But I don't know if the manufacturers here have really focused on that as their main priority and top concern, rather saying, let's just get these vehicles out, let's get people to adopt these vehicles, and not really thinking about what are the pain points and how does my solution alleviate these pain points within prospective EV buyers.
There's a lot of elements there. When we talked to Dr. Genevieve Guiliano of USC, she made the comment that today's our policies are pushing for results that the market isn't ready for. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I think that to a certain degree, yes, but it's hard to know, right? Because it's hard to know why we are unable to achieve the same level of adoption as has been achieved. What are the biggest factors, right? I think it's still an open question of what is keeping all of us from going electric. That we can start stacking up the issues. Is it because our gasoline prices are too low? Is it because the electric vehicles are more expensive? Although many of them aren't that much more expensive. Is it because there's not enough charging stations? Is it because people don't have garages? Like, what is it? What are all of the myriad issues that come together? And I think a lot of the research has really focused on one aspect or another, right? Like, let's see how more charging stations leads to greater demand, or let's see how reducing the price of the vehicle raises the demand, or things like that. But we haven't really sort of holistically viewed all of these challenges together and said, where's the policy levers that we can pull? Because demand is people responding to incentives, right? And so it's not just that like demand is not there. It's what incentives do people face and what challenges do they face? And so, for example, gasoline prices are, quite frankly, like very, very low. Our gasoline taxes are some of the lowest taxes in the world, right? That is not doing us any favors. That's not helping us move to a more electrified future, right? So it's not that demand isn't there, or is it just that, hey, we are all responding to the incentives that we face, and there are ways that policy that's not just let's just dump a bunch of money into charging stations, or let's just dump a bunch of money into subsidies, but really think about what are all those factors that affect our ability to go electric, and then choose the right policy levers to do so. And like, so for example, right, as we just spoke about, our emissions standards do nothing to try to push those big trucks to be electric, right? There's no incentive for them to do that, right? Or the incentive is reduced. We don't have, we're unwilling to even entertain the idea of gasoline taxes. Hey, that's a policy that we could push forward, right? So there's things that we could do, but we're unwilling to do it because of politics. And so we end up with these policy solutions that are partial and that are really only going to be able to chip away, but without doing everything all at once and really having a much more holistic view of the big policy levers that would be most effective in moving the needle. I think we're just going to keep throwing money against the wall to see what sticks, and it's probably not going to be the most efficient solution.
Well, there's certainly more topics for research. That's for sure. Just to go into one more article here. This is from the world famous mobility expert, Dr. Beia Spiller. When we read one of your articles. So in a recent one where you were talking about medium and heavy duty vehicles, you said that long haul trucking is one of the keys to ensuring we meet our decarbonization goals for transportation sector. Unfortunately, the current models that are being used by agencies in estimating the effectiveness and efficiencies of these programs are unlikely to give us the correct answer. Why is it? Because they fall in three specific areas. They don't capture the soft cost of the transition. They don't capture important market forces such as market concentration, and they don't account for the new source bias, which means improved standards do nothing to affect the used vehicle fleet. Can you expand on some of those criteria and talk a little bit about why we are missing the boat on such an important sector?
Well, so first of all, I would just say that all of these issues are relevant for all different types of medium heavy duty vehicles, not just long haul, though long haul has some of the biggest hurdles to face. But yeah, when it comes to the models that are being used by agencies, right, they tend to rely upon engineering models that try to estimate the total cost of ownership, right? It's merely a financial model. And so what is it that these models are missing? The first one is these soft costs. What are soft costs? These are things like learning, right? Transitional issues that you have to deal with as a fleet when you go electric. It's not just, you don't just replace the truck with an electric one and then go about your business in the exact same way, right? You have to change how you drive, how you refuel the vehicles. There's changes in operations and maintenance, and all of these things can just make it a little harder to electrify. So even if it would make financial sense for a fleet to electrify, if they do choose to go electric, for example, now all of a sudden they're facing all these other challenges, and they could just like give up, or other fleets might say, oh, I've heard about all of these difficulties. And like one of them is just like, how do you apply for a grant to get funds to purchase your fleet from the federal government? Some of these grant programs are really tricky and really complex. And so it'd be really hard to actually put in a grant application. So a lot of fleets might just sort of look at all these challenges and say, I'm not even gonna think about it. I'm just gonna give up. And so it's likely that these soft costs or these transition costs are keeping fleets from electrifying. But if you look at the model, the total cost of ownership model, you say, oh, well, it makes financial sense, so move forward, right? But that's not actually happening. So that's on the soft costs. The market concentration is a big issue. And so as an example, take like the bus segments, right? There's very few established transit bus providers that actually make electric vehicles. So if a transit agency, they want to go buy a vehicle, they really don't have a lot of options. And part of that is because there's these Buy America provisions where they can only purchase vehicles that were made here in the United States. And so it limits competition because you can't just say like, oh, it's too expensive here, I'll go somewhere else. So without competition, or in situations where there's limited competition, it's hard to get those prices to come down. And this is especially important when we think about a subsidy. So when we look again at the total cost of ownership models, they'll say there's a $50,000 subsidy, ergo the price of the vehicle is now $50,000 less, and they put that into the model. That's not true, because the manufacturers could just easily just raise the price by $50,000 and keep that benefit for themselves. And so this is what we call the pass-through of the subsidy. How much of that money is actually going to go to resulting in a lower cost for the consumer? It's going to be a lot lower in the setting of market concentration. So I think this is why we're seeing such high prices of, for example, electric school buses. So the government is actually paying for a huge amount of that upfront cost, and manufacturers appear to be somewhat taking advantage of that to be able to increase their profits and make up for these big investments that they had to. And then the final issue is new source bias, right? Which is, as you said, we put regulations on new vehicle sales and not on the old vehicle sales, right? And it does absolutely nothing to improve the fuel efficiency of the fossil fuel vehicles on the road or get them off the road. And this is particularly true with medium heavy duty vehicles because these vehicles can stick around for decades. Like we're seeing vehicles 50, 60 years on the road. It's a lot. It's not always the same company that owns it, right? So maybe you start off, it's a long haul vehicle owned by a shipper. They will then sell it to maybe a port to use as a drayage vehicle. And then maybe, after a decade or two, that port will sell it to a third owner, will use it for a different type of application. So they're switching hands. And And one of the challenges is that um, even with these new standards, and even if it's not electric standards, so in the medium heavy duty vehicle regulations, they have standards that just make the new vehicles more efficient, but that does actually raise the cost. And so what we've seen is that as these emission standards have become more stringent, we're actually seeing these vehicles being on the road for longer and longer. So people are just not getting rid of the vehicles. They're not scrapping them because they're like, well, it'd be too expensive to buy a new more efficient vehicle. I'll just hang on to my diesel vehicle for longer. So we need to be thinking about things like scrappage programs, right? And which is like, we'll pay you to punch a hole in your engine while you go to buy a new vehicle. But the problem with these models that are being leveraged by the agencies is that they don't think about how the regulations could affect that scrappage decision. And if they're not thinking about that, then they're going to overestimate how the environmental benefit of their new regulations.
Often you read in the media that just a certain percentage of new cars are going towards EVs, right? Which is true. I mean, they're you're talking about California near 25%, and even Colorado is near 25%. But that doesn't say is any old car, moved off the lot. It's just the new ones, and maybe a new market for somebody and that kind of thing. There was also a story that a small school district near where I live, got a big government grant, as she was talking about, for school buses, and it was like the government the grant paid for the whole bus. They didn't really, there was no out of pocket sort of cost,
Right.
so it seemed like you got a free bus, right? Well, it turns out there aren't very many mechanics that really know how to deal with the electric transmission. So one of their fancy $100,000 new school buses is sitting in the lot waiting for parts and a mechanic because the whole market's not there to support the life cycle of a bus, if you will.
Yeah.
So not much benefit being made.
Or you might have these programs where they're like, well, we'll give you, let's say, $350,000. That's supposed to go for both the bus and the charger, but now the bus costs $350,000, so they spend all the money on the bus, and now they're faced with really large outlay for the charging station itself and the electric grid upgrades. When the utility comes and says, hey, we'll upgrade your system, but it's going to cost you, $500,000. Like, how is the school district supposed to pay for this? So there's all these other issues that have nothing to do with the car itself, but like the charging infrastructure and the upgrades to the system, or even I've heard about depots that, aren't like the right height for the electric vehicle, particularly with like transit buses, right? Like, oh, they need to be a specific height, and they're not tall enough. So there's all these weird things about the depot itself and where these vehicles are. There was this really interesting conversation I had a few years back with a local beverage delivery company here in Manhattan. And they had a very progressive CEO, and he really wanted to go electric. So he tells his fleet manager, buy 6 electric trucks. So the guy goes out, puts in a purchase order, and then he calls the utility after he'd already purchased the vehicle. The vehicles are coming in, say a few months. He calls the electric utility. The utility comes out to the depot and says, you don't have enough power here to put in any charging stations. And so this guy is scrambling, like, can I reroute power from this appliance, to the charger? And where are the public charging stations, which there really aren't any, you can't use that. One of their depots had no power whatsoever. It was out in Red Hook, where it's like this sort of industrial area of Brooklyn, along the water, that the parts of it that there's just no electric power. And so, if there's no power there, what are they going to do? How are they actually going to be able to charge their vehicles? So the last thing I heard, they were trying to scramble to like figure out a solution until they're able to figure out these depot issues. So it's way more complicated than just having enough money to purchase the vehicle.
Well, maybe the subtitles for this is for our interview here is the rest of the story or something like that, because
Yeah.
it's more complicated. Well, this has been great. Let me just kind of close our conversation with just a couple of quick things. Um, and this one, a lot of our audience here for our Energy Transition Talk podcast is that trying to aim at the next generation, at university students and the general public, the ones who are really going to live in this society we're trying to build. Could you give a message to the next generation about the future of mobility? What would that be? Could they be thinking about breaking with their parents' American dream of owning a car in a garage and begin to think of mobility differently?
Look, I think people are going to do what makes sense to them, right? Given the incentives and the costs that they face. We cannot expect the next generation to ditch the car if they live in a sprawling area, if there's no public transit and no micromobility. I mean, we cannot expect people to just make their lives worse if they, just to be able to, reduce the emissions, right? And so in the end, what's really important is for the youth to actually work to help advocate for policies that will drive improved mobility, right? I've seen just how passionate and effective young people can be in pushing organizations to change, right? Think about like all the action to diversify and diversify and disinvest in fossil fuel companies, right? Lots of pressure for universities to do so. I think this is really good effort, and young people can really continue to make that effort, make the case for policies that will improve mobility. And they can also, for example, work with their universities or local transit authorities to sort of help them figure out how to decarbonize their transportation system. So as an example, one of my colleagues, while he was doing his master's at Duke, he did this capstone project where he actually worked with the local transit authority to figure out what were the logistics for that transit authority to go to an electric fleet, right? They did the whole modeling, like an entire model of their service territory, and really work with them to figure out the logistics. And so there's these ways in which the next generation can help with research and advocacy, particularly because they're so advanced in computer programming, right? They really have the skills to be able to inform policy in a way that's really meaningful and inform action by their universities or the local transit authorities or the local city governments, right? They can work with them and provide that type of support. So I think, just encourage students to really work for a better future through choosing wisely, where you work, where you intern, where you volunteer, so that your actions can help push forward decarbonization policies and policies that improve mobility for all. But just expecting people to take personal change and start to ride their bikes more is not going to get us that major transformation that we need, and that can be achieved through the actions of youth engaging in research and policy.
No, we totally agree with that fact that their voice and their brains and their hands have to get involved and be part of the solution, whatever that solution is going to look
Yep.
like. Well, again, just tremendous opportunity here to talk to you. Always enjoy it. Hope we can, talk again sometime across the country here. But is there anything else to close that we haven't talked about that I didn't kind of tee up for you that you think is important in really understanding this idea of reimagining mobility?
Well, I think we've sort of alluded to it, but I just want to put the pin on it, which is there is no silver bullet here, right? To be able to improve mobility and reduce emissions in the transportation sector, it is going to require us to take a holistic approach to problem solving. And what that is really going to require is for us to think interdisciplinary, right? We can't just approach the solution as economists, as engineers, as urban planners. We all have to be working together across the disciplines to be able to come up with policies that really make sense and address all the different aspects that we face in society. And so I'll just let folks know. So I launched in this fall, I launched a critical minerals research lab. So what this lab is it's a virtual get together of PhD students from across the country who are working on critical minerals for the clean energy transition, really thinking about policy. They're from a variety of disciplines. So we have folks from econ, engineering, geography, law, et cetera. And so the idea is for them to come together and be able to present their work to each other, get feedback from very different points of view, and then collaborate together to come up with, research that can really help inform policy making in a way that makes sense. So, we're planning on doing this again next year. So if there's any PhD students out there, keep your eye open for the call, which is going to come out in the summer. We're going to be hosting a conference where the students can present their work to a broad general audience. So that's going to happen in June. And more broadly, I will say, Resources for the Future, we do a lot of really cool work on transportation. We always have openings for interns. And more broadly, I'm always open to work with folks on research questions. So even if there is a paid position, if folks want to reach out to me, work with me on any question that they think it's interesting, I'm always, my door is always open. You can contact me via email. All my information is online, and I'm always happy to talk with the younger generation and provide any advice that I can on how they can move.
Well, I certainly don't represent the younger generation, but I appreciate the invitation that you are making to the university. It turns out that I found you. I mean, we've never met before, but I found you by watching you on an episode of Energy Switch with Dr. Scott Tinker one time. That's where I kind of chased you down that way. But I guess here again, conclusion again. So our thanks. But I think you conclude. You said that it's, and I'm a massacre of metaphor here, but it takes a village to reimagine mobility.
It does. It really does, especially if we want to also achieve decarbonization goals at the same time.
Well, thank you, Dr. Spiller. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Transportation solutions are not just electrification, but as we heard, it's getting people out of their cars.
Well, the main problem is that many cities are designed for cars. So, for example, San Bernardino, California, is about 49% covered in parking spaces, which is a little bit insane to think about.
Yeah, it really is. And as we heard, we really need policies that make it more expensive and more difficult to drive. The congestion pricing, for example, like I'm thinking of New York City, it shows a true cost of driving on the environment.
One way to sort of drive change is to increase gasoline taxes and make it more attractive for to take public transportation, to make it easier and faster.
It's going to be hard to restructure major cities like Los Angeles and New York away from cars. But we need a solution with less investment and disruption, like, charging station locations. And this is going to require a more deliberate approach. It's going to take some time and also a lot of community engagement, as we heard.
And one out of the box idea coming out of Boise, Idaho, is electric minibus shuttles. So in smaller cities with on-demand services, it'd be a great way to push people towards public transportation.
Yeah, and I think one of the key takeaways that we heard was that there's no one optimal approach when it comes to optimizing these systems.
Exactly. And we're sort of seeing how vehicle manufacturers are now having a new EV strategy of having hybrid vehicles. So it takes more time to reduce cost, it increases range and improves charging time as well, and sort of pushes people towards EVs.
Well, it is easier to electrify the grid than to, electrify transportation.
Yeah, another question is are gasoline prices too low? That it's not doing us any more favors to moving towards electrification, but the public that are driving really likes them.
And as our new regulations get stricter and more expensive as well, people are going to hang on to their cars and vehicles a lot longer.
And Electric Vehicle 101 is particularly important when we get beyond passenger cars and when we start thinking about heavier equipment, heavy duty trucks or heavy equipment, right? So the EV 101 is that cars have used gasoline and diesel fuel for a very long time because it has a very high energy density. And what that means is that for every pound of fuel that you're carrying, it has much more energy than other types of fuels. So an electric battery carries maybe 1/100th per pound of energy relative to gasoline or diesel. So what that means is that in a vehicle, you have to carry around your energy, unless we have an electrical system, right? Like our passenger rail systems, where you could do a third rail for energy. But anything that's on wheels has to carry its energy with it. And what that means is that if I'm carrying gasoline or diesel for a couple 100 pounds, I can go a long way. Okay. But in the case of a battery, I need thousands of pounds of battery to be able to go a reasonable distance. And then, of course, the heavier the battery, the further you can go, but the less you can carry in terms of cargo. So it's a very big problem for trucks. So I think we're in a period now where in some ways we're thinking that electricity is the answer, but in other ways we're coming upon the sort of challenges, right? Now that we're actually trying to do it, we're coming up on a lot of challenges.
Okay, thank you. And so we know there's a lot of factors that push the electrification of transportation, and we just want to single out a couple of them. So we're wondering how public policy, technology, and public perception, as well as economic trends, combine to basically push the electrification of transportation.
Okay, so let's start with economics.
Mhm.
The economics are that right now, EVs are not the economic choice. And the reason is that they are still much more expensive to buy, and they still perform at a lower level of performance than the conventional internal combustion engine. Okay, so the economics are that we're giving out subsidies to entice people to buy the cars, and we're hoping that we can get past that flat part of the S curve and get enough scale going so that prices will go down. So the economic case today is not there. Okay. That's even more true in the heavy duty market. In the heavy duty market, trucks, a new diesel truck will cost somewhere between $100,000 and $120,000. A new battery electric truck will cost $500,000, between $500,000 and $600,000. Same for hydrogen right now. So you're asking people to purchase a vehicle that's 5 times as expensive and does not do the same amount of work. So one of our big challenges is, how do we address the economics now? And that means we have to give out a whole lot of subsidies to address that.
Yeah.
And that's a public policy issue for sure. On the technology side, and this is a combination technology public policy, our policies, particularly in California, are what we call technology forcing. Okay. And a technology forcing policy is, I set a policy that establishes a goal for which current technology is not available to meet. So we're still in what I would call the demonstration phase in many ways.
Yeah. So you're saying that the economic trends basically are pushing public away from EVs, while policy is kind of propelling us forward, and people are having mixed feelings about it, essentially. So these trends are pulling in opposite directions.
Well, what I'm saying is that it's very hard to move against the market, basically, and that's the same. It's true way beyond transportation. It's always very hard to work against the market, and that's what we're doing. We're trying to push the market forward. We're trying to push technology forward. Are we all going to become more attracted to public transportation or to collective means of travel? So are we going to use, are AVs going to become everybody's taxi service and none of us will own cars? Or will something else happen? And I think we should be thinking more about all of those trends happening together than we actually do. So, we're talking about EVs here as if nothing else in the world is changing. But everything else in the travel world is changing at the same time.
Thank you.
I think I've also seen those little robots around the streets or outside USC of like delivering food.
Correct.
Well, those are also electric, which is kind of interesting.
Right.
But Dr. Guiliano, thank you so much for your time today. Before we leave, is there anything else we forgot to ask you that you think is important to share with our audience today?
I think you've asked some very good questions, and I think we've had a good conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us for the Future of Energy. Special thanks to each of our guests today and to our technical wizard, Abhi, for his important contributions to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to all our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.